So, here's one in case anyone is interested. This took place before I was born, while my family was still living in Mexico, in a small town undisturbed by modernization. When my oldest brother was a baby, my mom, being very young at the time, was very protective of him. After all, it was her first child and would do anything to keep him from harm. Any of us, really. She had this uncle who people said practiced foul and disgusting black magic. The kind that causes misfortune, jealousy, and even death. However, this man was respected and not to be trifled with. One evening, he came over to visit my grandmother. As they sat in the kitchen talking, my brother, who was in his baby walker, wandered over to him. The uncle, whose name I don't remember and probably for good reason, reached down to pick my brother up. At that moment, my mom quickly came over and snatched him up. He knew what this man did and did not want him touching her baby. He looks at her with a sinister stare and simply says, "All right, I'll be on my way now." As soon as he left my grandma, she looks at my mom and tells her, "You shouldn't have done that. You should have at least let him touch him." My mom paid no attention to this warning and set my brother down to help my grandmother with dinner. Moments later, my mom noticed my brother under the table reaching up and playing with something. She goes to grab him from under the table, and to her horror, sees a bunch of black widow spiders within his reach. All of a sudden, he starts crying like never before. At first, she thinks a spider has bitten him, but after checking him, she doesn't find a bite. She starts cradling and rocking him, trying to calm him down, but nothing is working. It starts getting late, and he's still crying. My mother is desperate and doesn't know what to do. My grandma comes over and says, "Take the baby to go see him. You didn't want him to touch him, and now your child is paying the price. Go before it gets too dark out. I'll go with you." They make their way on their foot over to this guy's house, and after a while, they finally get to his place. Now at this point, my brother is struggling to breathe, let alone stay conscious. They knock and he opens. "Please, we need your help. The baby is struggling to breathe and he won't stop crying, and we don't know what to do." He looks at them and looks at the baby and says, "All right, I'll take a look at him. Hand him to me." My mother reluctantly gives my brother him, and he places his hand on his chest and begins to gently massage him. He then says, "That's what I thought. You didn't want me to touch you." At that moment, my mom said the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, because she knew it was his doing. Not a second after he was done, my brother immediately fell asleep. He gave the baby back. They said their goodbyes, and my mom and grandma made their way home. My mother was in tears as they walked back. This horrible old man, out of spite, caused my brother to suffer. From that day on, they rarely saw him, but whenever he came over, my mom made sure he held my brother any time he ever requested. I was raised in a Santeria household. Both my father's side and my mother's side have strong female Santeros, which can mean a wide range of things, but usually it boils down to having some type of gift or knowledge. Since you are asking about negative experiences, I can give you the one which actually made me begin to believe there was some truth to it. For reference, my father is from the Dominican Republic and my mother is from Puerto Rico. Two islands who historically have a mutual distaste for another. My grandmother, on my father's side, always hated my mom for being Puerto Rican, and she would make it known, but was never exactly overt in what she would say. She is what believers would call powerful. People in Miami would give her offerings for her work. So one summer, when I was about 8, my family visited Grandma in Miami, and the tension got too much, and my mother, usually very quiet and reserved, spoke back and disrespected my grandmother. My father sided with my mother, and my grandmother said something which, at the time, I found almost funny. This is a rough translation, but she essentially said, "She will see his ass rot out, and his stomach pop." It's not like a Hispanic saying, it's just as weird and out of place in that language. She also said that his house would collapse around him for being disrespectful, and he would go back to the streets. At this point, my father was extremely healthy and only around 30 years old. Financially, my family had been doing great and was on the up and up. Following that whole situation, within 3 years, my father suffered from multiple serious ailments with his rectum and colon, has had to have stomach surgery, lost both of his jobs, and we eventually lost our house. But first, a section of the roof literally gave in, and we would live in a shelter for a year. In general, I noticed my family seemed to suffer, and in the back of my mind, I would always think that was the cause. A few years later, another Santero, a very well-known one in the Bronx, told my mother that my grandmother, who she spoke of with a level of respect, had did evil towards my family without knowing anything about us. Around the time of my 17th birthday, my parents reached out to her and squashed their issues. Almost immediately, there was a change in our fortune. It was the weirdest thing. Too many details to write on mobile, but it was tangible differences in our luck. And my father's health improved, and now 6 years later, he hasn't had any major issues. I'm the only one in my family who hasn't forgiven her. She often calls and asks to speak to me. However, I still have too much to hate. Even if she wasn't the cause of our sufferings, she abandoned us and commanded a whole side of my extended family to do the same. Unforgivable to me. But I will say is that I do have a fear and respect for her. I know not everyone is a believer, but there is something to people who have gifts. A friend of mine told me once about one of those witches who lived in the village where his mom and aunt were born. Since they were kids, my friend's grandmother told her daughters to not be scared of that woman, but also to not approach her or let her approach them. The girls didn't have any problem with her. They eventually grow up and move to a larger city. But when my friend's cousin was born, in one of the trips to that village, somehow someone got distracted and the woman got closer to him. When they noticed, the woman was staring at him, but she didn't do anything else. After that, apparently the baby wasn't hungry anymore. He didn't want to eat, and if he ate anything, he ended up vomiting. His grandma eventually found a woman in another village that made some concoction for the baby, but she said she couldn't tell anyone the nature of that mixture, otherwise the life of the baby would be in danger. My friend's cousin took that thing and recovered almost immediately. That's the story my friend told me, though I personally think that there's a lot of bad superstitions going on there. He also told me something else, but that wasn't related to his family, so I took it like a legend or folklore. Anyway, I think it's a good story to share. Apparently that woman had a daughter who was in love with another man in the village, but the man got engaged with some other woman, and the daughter suffered a lot for this. Anyway, the happy couple got married, and the witch showed up at the wedding and told the bride that she was happy now she wouldn't have a husband for more than a year. 3 months later, the married couple was expecting a baby, but, as the witch said, the husband died a few months later. The widow was devastated and still pregnant, so for health reasons, her family didn't let her be at his funeral. Apparently, while the funeral was going, she was in bed and was hearing furious scratches on the ceiling. She told her family to go and to stop the noise, but they couldn't find the source, so they blamed some stray cats. She couldn't stop hearing those scratches all night. Many years later, the widow eventually died and they had to dig up the niche, those graves on the walls, where the husband has been because they wanted to be buried together. The legend says that they found scratches inside of his coffin, and that's what the widow had been hearing. This is my own experience with my coursework in life. A little history on my family. My family has a history of seeing things on both my maternal and paternal side. My dad saw ghosts and heard things, but blocked it out. I have heard ghost stories about Grandpa and other people. Cousin and grandma on my mom's side knew things. The cousin is a pretty serious medium. My sister has seen things most of her life, including dreams about the dead. Unfortunately, though, this is all situated with a longer history of varying ethnic backgrounds, including Bermudan at one point. I have seen a few things about the terror and anticipation of it, but most of it blocked most of my sight. My husband grew up with white, light Christian parents who used religion like holy magic, and he could see auras. We have experimented with this better than average psychic tests. Nothing really repeatable as of yet, but a greater than average number of hits given a complicated setup. More than anything, I grew up with a really skeptical attitude, with initially doesn't help practice. Long story short, my husband and I are both practicing witches. Witchcraft works with the predicate that ritual of one sort or another impacts the subconscious and alters events so the probability of an event increases. There's not a simpler way to put it. I have witnessed hexes firsthand, and in my youth made the mistake of picking people to experiment on. After a certain power level, through meditation and spirit work, negative manifestation occurs mostly on autopilot. This may or may not explain things like the evil eye, etc., as others have written. The single best way for a witch, or a worker, or a magician, or a spiritualist to stop unconsciously sending out baneful works is, in my experience, to start working with positive energies, as I make it a habit as of now. Since becoming more active in the community, I have brushed elbows with other adepts, for lack of a better word. I have met a couple people throughout my life that my subconscious has told me to stay far away from for no discernible reason. A few people I know are workers. My father is an unconscious manifester, and one of those people that causes change by merely obsessing over a wriggling worry. I have saved myself a lot of grief by staying away from him, as he tends to unconsciously manifest a lot of negativity in his sphere, and his personality sucks in the material world. I'm rambling right now, as I am very, very high. I just wanted to tell a story about a former friend of mine. We were both very powerful, and both had a background in darker earth-based magic. She and I made the mistake of rooming together, and her literal presence, which had always triggered my gut instinct to flee from as negative and dangerous when meditating, started to drive me insane. Of course, there were mundane issues as well, but when we got pissed off at each other, more and more increasingly annoying things would go wrong. Pop tires on one car, borrow a second, leave the lights on because daytime, cold snap that fries the engine, no jumper cables, and everybody's out of town, so we can't be rescued. There's something that I could hardly describe. I don't want to blame it squarely on her, as it's not even fair if I don't consider her a friend anymore, but after the preceding incident, she looked at me and said, "Maybe this is a sign." Our magic would get all twisted and tangled up, and cause really bad things on both sides. When I got fed up and kicked her out for mundane reasons on my side, I burned sage for weeks and chanted and prayed to keep the baneful influence away, because I knew that she would retaliate. Unfortunately, 3 weeks in, I almost hit a dog with my car and grew very ill, as expected, and barely recovered. Since removing her from my life, my health has vastly improved. Whether this is material or some sort of negative energistic effect, I am unsure of. I still cannot look at her without unreasonable hate and have blocked her from my reality. Which sucks, but I know instinctively my magic, or whatever you want to call it, will target her directly in retaliation. And she is not the only other worker I've met that I cannot stand to be around because of their energy. Which I know sounds fluffy bunny, but when you research their history, it's dark, dark shit, which is what I initially trained in. I try to be a good person, and have emotionally matured a lot since then, though I'm still a work in progress. There are not so many people fired around me, or breaking legs after they treat me like crap, so maybe that's a sign I'm doing better than I was. And I do a lot of healing for people, or at least try to help them spiritually and materially. The power is a difficult thing because if you're raised skeptical, you figure there's no foul when you see it on someone because it's a coincidence. But the thing is, the coincidences keep happening afterward, and soon enough you start to internalize it. Now when I think of all the warnings about focusing on healing energy and positivity when I was younger, I know why the teachers are all so worried. When I was in middle school, my mother gave me her spell book. Witches are real, she said, and anybody can be one. Then she gave me her Ouija board and an ancient, creepy, melty red candle that looked like something Vincent Price would have had. Don't ever light the candle, she warned me. So, what does 12-year-old me do? All of my spells worked. And in retrospect, it's entirely possible that I just don't remember the ones that didn't work. But there were some coincidences I still can't explain. I was mad at this one boy for something, so we made a voodoo doll and stabbed it over and over in the butt. Within a very short span of time, quite possibly that very same day, the kid gets into a four-wheeler accident and breaks his tailbone. We did a second doll that night too, which we stabbed in the stomach, and the girl got appendicitis. Then, to top off witchcraft night, we made up a chant that I kind of just felt was powerful and used it on my parakeet, and she was dead the next morning. Those are major coincidences, no? To top it off, the friend that I was with the night told a few of our other friends, who of course didn't believe us. So one of them made requests for proof and personal gain. The first was that we would not have math class that day, which she thought was impossible since we had math every day. Turns out the teacher wound up doing a day entirely devoted to science. Conveniently, she still didn't believe me. "Make me get a nice smiley face shirt," she said. One did not immediately appear, however. Her disbelief was suspended as soon as she got home from school one day to find that her mother had gotten her a new shirt, and of course with a smiley face decal on it. And then it became mine because she was too freaked out to keep the shirt. We'd been best friends all throughout elementary school, but stopped after that year. Maybe that was why. So I think it's just something my family can do. We don't talk about it, though my dad can do some pretty creepy things, and I guess so can I. My curses ended in middle school, for the most part. Every so often, if a person truly deserves it, and the universe isn't helping karma along, I'll try to help make sure they get what they deserve. But I don't do anything other than be mindful of the fact, and I'm not sure if it's ever worked because I don't keep those people in my life if they suck badly. This happened to a friend of mine right after graduating college. She was about 21 and had been seeing a guy for several years. She was very serious about him, even though we felt he wasn't the type to commit, and told him that she was old-fashioned and wanted to be married and have a family. In our last year, she even prayed once for guidance and had a dream where she was in a wedding dress all alone. We tried to persuade her that it was a sign to give the guy up, but she was head over heels in love with him. She wasn't obsessive, just very naive. After graduating, she told us the guy had finally decided to step up and had spoken to her mother. Then suddenly, our friend stopped picking up her phone. For several months, we tried to reach her and even spoke to her siblings who said everything was fine before quickly disappearing. More than a year later, one girl finally breaks through and gets the whole story and manages to arrange a meeting with our whole group. That day, our friend tells us what happened. Apparently, when the guy's aunt, who lives in a neighboring country, learns that the guy is planning to marry my friend, she absolutely flips her shit. She had planned for him to marry her own daughter, which is allowed in this part of the world, who was the strange girl who was stealing her future son-in-law from her. She had to pay. Instead of reaching out to my friend and telling her to leave the guy alone, she decides to curse her. Yep, turns out Auntie Dearest is a powerful witch, and not the kind that does good. Friend has no idea about any of this and suddenly starts waking up every single night at 3 a.m. screaming her head off. Just sits up in bed and screams, waking up the whole household, who try everything they can think of to make her stop. Nothing works, and about an hour later, friend stops screaming, lays back down in bed and sleeps. Next day, she doesn't remember a thing. Her family takes her to every doctor in the country, but none of them can find anything wrong, physically or emotionally. They take her to the doctors outside the country, and they don't find anything either. Her family is now desperate and trying to think outside the box. This is when they somehow discover about the guy's aunt and promptly cut all contact with him. The friend asks about him a few times, only to be firmly told to forget him and never speak about him ever again. During all of this, the nightly 3 a.m. screaming fits don't stop, and an old health problem flares up that requires an open heart surgery. I don't know how many countries, doctors, exams, and healers they had seen at this point, but almost a year later, they're told about a religious man with a gift. They fly to him, and he manages to undo the curse. Friend is physically and emotionally racked at this point, and under constant monitoring by her family. We don't blame them. Friend even tells us that the aunt witch had told her in the beginning to leave the guy she would have. She was completely broken. The next year, our friend gets married to a seemingly nice guy, and we think she's finally getting her happily ever after. Last I heard, the husband turned out to be neglectful and a womanizer. They divorced, and she's now a single mother living on government aid. I don't know if it's because of the curse, but I wouldn't be surprised. My grandpa told me this story over the weekend when they came up to visit my family. He's from a small town in Mexico where almost everybody owns acres of land where they grow wheat, barley, and corn. Well, the lands are located on the lower part of town since the town is located in a hill, and you have the top part of the town, the middle, and the downside. It's mainly a dirt road with oak trees and mesquite trees, usually covering the acres. Anyway, my grandpa and his uncle had to go down to water the crops. They used water that comes down from the river to water it, and if they wanted to get the good water, they had to go at midnight. So my grandfather headed down with a flashlight and machete on hand. Walking down the dirt road, he said he was meeting his uncle down there. Once he got there, his uncle wasn't there yet, so he lied down in the grass, waiting for his uncle in the water, looking up to the sky and the huge oak trees, when he said he heard something, and while looking up, he saw a shadow darker than the night. It stood out. He said it was flying from one tree to the other, and every time he wanted to flash it with a flashlight, his flashlight wouldn't turn on. He said it flew by like 4 times. When he heard steps and got really quick, it was his uncle. The uncle asked him if the water had come down yet, to which my grandfather replied no. Then, he asked him if he had been seeing or hearing anything weird, and my grandfather told him what had just happened. That's when his uncle told him that he was just walking down the road, and he saw a dark figure that he just stared at it, and then the figure got bigger, and it took off flying towards my grandfather. They believed it was a witch in the form of an owl, since several people from that town have seen it before. Probably not that scary, but it was creepy indeed. My grandfather grew up in Jacksonville, Texas, back in the 1950s, and if you haven't been there, you wouldn't be missing much. He grew up as the oldest of 5 brothers and sisters on a farm with his ma and pa. He passed away about a year ago, but I wanted to share a story he told me while I came home from college for break. Naturally, Papa didn't come from much. His parents' generation suffered through the Great Depression, and farmers didn't fare off too well. But, being the gritty Texas farm folk that they were, they thrived in it. Having a farm in a big pasture surrounded by the pine trees made for a good childhood, he told me. He would reminisce the times of gathering the whole town's kids to play baseball games to pass the hot summer days. Though, as his health deteriorated, he began to talk more deeply with me, and actually talked to me a lot about life lessons, and one thing in particular, fear. He asked me if I have ever heard of witches. I said of course. But he stops me and, as serious as he could be, asked again. No, not the Halloween characters, but actual witches. I told him that I did. I could tell it made him uncomfortable talking about it, because it really screwed him up as a kid. He explained to me that he had encountered one 3 times growing up. The first time he saw her was when he was 10 years old. He and his siblings were playing around sundown outside in the pasture when he said it happened. About 200 yards away from him, where the tree line of the forest began, was where he could see a dark, floating silhouette. He said that he couldn't focus because of the lack of light, but he swore to me that the figure's head was cocked to a perfect 90-degree angle, looking right at him. He said it was inhuman, and remembers rushing the little ones in and telling his parents. They did not let the kids down after sundown, ever. The second encounter was when he was 12 years old. He and a friend who was their closest neighbor would walk on a trail through the forest to school every day. He said it was about a 2.5-mile walk, but one day as they were walking home, they saw a bum covered in quilts walking on the left side of the trail. Being very confused by why somebody who they didn't know, who was completely submerged in dirty quilts, would be on this trail in the woods. They eerily stared at the person as it passed them. He said that he smelt something like a mix of rotten and sour. As the person passed, Grandpa said that he had become very dizzy and incoherent to what he was doing. He pointed out to me that he felt drunk, and that the neighbor boy felt the same way. A few moments later, he hears a snarly giggle behind them, and it's the person covered in dirty quilts. Still being completely hidden by the quilts, it began running after them. He said he didn't stop running until he had busted down the door of the front door of his farmhouse. The neighbor's boy didn't ever come back to his house. The incident was widely spread around the town, and quickly became a warning to all of those who go in the forest. He told me he had never found out what happened to the poor kid. The third time, and last time he saw the witch, was when he was a senior in high school. Grandpa was going to be a Division I football player for the University of Oklahoma, and quite frankly was the hometown hero. He said that he had just met my grandmother, and really wanted to enjoy the rest of his senior year before he left to the Sooners. He attended a prom after party in the woods with his classmates. Being that his class only had 60 people, everybody was out there. He admitted that he got pretty lit, and wanted to fool around with my grandmother. Ew. He went to take a leak a couple of yards away from the bonfire, and heard shuffling noises. As he tried to focus, he said he saw a hut. A small stream of smoke was emitting from its chimney, and smelt like the stench he recognized when he was 12. He told me he had never gotten sober that quickly. As he proceeded to investigate this hut deep in the forest, a dark figure emerged from the shadows. He tried to focus on its face, but told me he could never quite get a good look at it. All of a sudden, the figure started to whisper. As it intensified, he felt a burn on his arm. He said that it felt just like when his fraternity brothers branded his body with their fraternity letters. After what the hell just happened, the figure slowly floated and submerged itself back into the darkness of the forest. He became frantic and realized that everybody was about 100 yards away from him. He said there was no way that he wandered off that far and started screaming for help. He admittedly told me that he wet his pants and couldn't help but chuckle a little. The creepiest part about the story is that the police investigated the hut that my grandpa had found in the woods. It was a freaking gore fest. A lot of dead animals and birds were found, as well as even human remains. There's no evidence it was the neighbor boy, but he said everybody knew it was. My grandfather was a fantastic person and the most kind, loving man I knew. I know he couldn't have made this up because he still has burn marks on his arm to where he felt the witch burn him on his prom night.